Strategy shapes history, and narrative controls power. The Church understood this perfectly. For 2,000 years, the story of Maria, the mother of Jesus, has been carefully edited, selectively canonized, and strategically silenced. The result? A woman who was barely visible in the Gospels became suddenly central to Christian theology. How? Why? When? These questions are explosive, yet the answers have been hidden. The Proto-Gospel of James, the earliest document dating to the 2nd century and possibly the 1st century, is preserved in Greek, Coptic, Syriac, Latin, and Armenian, translated worldwide, and influenced the liturgies of both East and West. It was never officially condemned, nor formally accepted, an example of strategic ambiguity the Church maintained. Why? Because its content was problematic. Maria's birth was surrounded by miraculous circumstances. Her parents, Joachim and Anna, were 70 years old and sterile their entire lives. In the Jewish society, this context is crucial, as sterility was considered a curse and a divine judgment. Joachim was rejected at the temple, his offering refused by the priest Reuben, who humiliated him publicly. This was a strategic move, reinforcing social control over women's roles in religion. Then came angelic intervention, a double visitation. Joachim in the desert and Anna at home received the identical message: conception promised. The message was known worldwide, strategically establishing Maria's importance. Her birth was recorded in unusual circumstances, with light flooding the house and a celestial fragrance filling the air. Angels sang invisibly. These witnesses documented the strategic, miraculous legitimation of her birth. At the age of 3, Maria was consecrated to the temple, an unprecedented action in Jewish practice, as women were forbidden from entering sacred areas, and menstruation was considered impurity. Yet Maria entered the Holy of Holies and lived there for 12 years. This was a strategic exception, revealing her special status. Apocryphal texts describe her being fed by angels daily and weaving the temple veil while praying constantly, growing in grace. The priests recognized something different, but the strategic accommodation allowed her to break the rules. When puberty presented an institutional crisis, Maria's menstruation presented a dilemma. A menstruating woman defiles the sacred. The priests faced a challenge and strategic solution: a marriage arrangement with Joseph, a widower of 60 years with 6 children from his previous marriage. Joseph, reluctant to be a guardian, swore to protect her virginity and never consummate the marriage. The strategic arrangement preserved her status. The selection of Joseph as her protector was miraculous. His rod flowered and a dove emerged, signaling divine confirmation of the strategic validation. This was an unmistakable, supernatural sign, affirming Maria's choice as the mother of Jesus. The Annunciation occurred, and Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but the tradition splits on the location. The canonical Gospels say it was a stable, while the apocryphal texts suggest it was a cave. Archaeology has confirmed the authenticity of Bethlehem, with the Nativity Basilica built over an authentic cave. This cave symbolism is powerful. Born in a cave, buried in a cave, and the earth's womb received him and returned him after resurrection. This is a strategic theological parallelism, but adult life silenced Maria. The canonical Gospels ignore her, and her 30 years disappeared. Where was she? What was she doing? These strategic omissions created a vacuum. Apocryphal texts suggest hidden powers, unexplained healings, fulfilled prophecies, and deep connections. But as Maria's sacred feminine powers were persecuted over the centuries, she was called witch by some, sorceress by others, and labeled manipulator by her enemies. Why? Because a woman with such power threatened the patriarchal structures. The patriarchy trembled, and the narrative was silenced. Manuscripts were burned, and dogmas were defined belatedly. The strategic suppression was aimed at maintaining control over the narrative. death became the greatest mystery. The Orthodox Church claims the Dormition, while the Catholics defend the Assumption of Maria. The Apocrypha suggest a resurrection, with 4 different versions, all conflicting. The tomb opened on the 3rd day, and Maria's body disappeared, leaving only supernatural fragrance. Apostles were transported on clouds, and Thomas, arriving late, asked to see the tomb, only to find it empty. Strategic ambiguity preserved the mystery for centuries. Jerusalem guards the tomb, but Epheso claims the house. These traditions are at war, and the truth is lost between versions. The Church took nearly 1900 years to define the dogma. Why? Because evidence conflicted, testimonies diverged, and manuscripts disappeared. The convenient way to maintain the mystery was to control the narrative and manipulate devotion through strategic delay. However, documents resurfaced and archaeology excavated the tombs. Traditions persisted, and now truth is emerging, unfiltered, undomesticated, and uncontrolled. The real Maria is emerging. She was not a passive vessel, but an active participant in history, not a silent observer, but a powerful presence. Not a domesticated saint, but a dangerous prophet who challenged the institutional powers of the Church. The Church Fathers knew this. Manuscripts prove it. Traditions preserve it, and silence screams. The strategy of control reveals itself. Those who controlled the narrative feared the truth would destabilize the foundations of the patriarchal structures. Because Maria was a powerful woman, the patriarchy feared her. The sacred feminine was suppressed for millennia, but now it is resurging. The strategic investigation continues, and the evidence mounts. The truth approaches, and we must prepare for the impact of Maria's real legacy. The Temple of Jerusalem, during the 1st century before Christ, represented a strategic hub of Jewish identity, religious control, and an economic powerhouse, which also served as a political leverage point. The Romans understood this. Herod the Great magnificently rebuilt it, and the construction was ongoing for decades. This was a massive project, detailed by Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews, Book 15. The structure was impressive, adorned with gold, marble, and cedar wood from Lebanon, and its walls towered high. The courts expanded with porticos surrounding the building. The Solomonic Temple was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 before Christ and was rebuilt by Zerubbabel in 516 before Christ. Herod's enhancements began in 20 before Christ and continued until 64 after Christ, when it was destroyed by the Romans in 70 after Christ. The strategic pattern was clear: control through religion, economic exploitation, and political manipulation. Roman standard practice saw the temple priests collaborate to maintain authority, collect tributes, and enforce orthodoxy. The Sadducees controlled the priesthood, forming a wealthy, aristocratic, and conservative group that denied the resurrection, as seen in the Book of Acts, chapter 23, verse 8. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe all these things. They also collaborated with Rome to maintain the status quo. In contrast, the Pharisees opposed the political structure, demanding purity and strategic positioning, aiming for popular support. The Essenes, however, withdrew entirely from the system, forming the Qumran community and preserving the Dead Sea Scrolls as evidence of their strategic separation, avoiding corruption. Mary entered this system at the age of 3, a strategic impossibility for a female, given the ritual impurity of her gender and the age prohibition in temple protocol. The temple was divided hierarchically, with the court of the Gentiles at the outermost level, followed by the court of women, then the court of Israel for men, and beyond that, the holy place, which was forbidden for most people. The Holy of Holies, the most sacred place, was absolutely prohibited to all but the high priest, who could enter only once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Josephus described the veil that separated these sacred spaces as being 60 feet high and 4 inches thick, making it impossible to tear humanly. Yet this veil was torn at the death of Christ, as recounted in Matthew chapter 27, verse 51, Mark chapter 15, verse 38, and Luke chapter 23, verse 45. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth quaked, and the rocks were split. This was a strategic miracle witnessed by many, marking a profound irony. Mary's hands had woven the veil, and God tore it, signaling the end of the Old Covenant and the beginning of the New Covenant. Mary's placement in the temple was strategic. The apocryphal texts describe that Mary was fed by angels daily and spent her time weaving the temple veil, a task of strategic importance. This veil separated the Holy of Holies, symbolizing the protected space only accessible by the high priest once a year. Mary's act of weaving the veil emphasizes her special status and divine selection. Her education at the temple included learning the Torah, Psalms, and the prophets, likely in Hebrew, perhaps Aramaic, and even Greek, as Jerusalem was a cosmopolitan city where multiple languages circulated. She witnessed and participated in the sacred festivals such as Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, absorbing a spiritual formation that lasted 12 uninterrupted years. However, she also observed religious politics and the theological intrigues of the time. The Sadducees denied the resurrection, as noted in the book of Acts, chapter 23, verse 8, while the Pharisees affirmed it. Debates were constant, creating a permanent tension, heightened by Roman occupation. The messianic fervor was palpable as the people awaited a national liberator to come. Mary, a girl in the temple, observed this context, but the world was also watching her. When puberty arrived, the menstruation crisis presented itself as an institutional problem. According to Leviticus chapter 15, verses 19 to 30, menstruation made a woman unclean, and Mary could not remain in the Holy of Holies. The priests faced a dilemma and proposed a strategic solution, an arranged marriage to Joseph, a widower of 60 years, who had 6 children from his previous marriage. Joseph's role was to protect Mary's virginity, and they never consummated the marriage, as the marriage arrangement preserved her status. The selection of Joseph as Mary's guardian was miraculous. His rod flowered, and a dove emerged as a divine sign, unmistakably confirming the choice. This strategic validation of Mary's virginity was a supernatural event that marked her as the mother of Jesus. The Annunciation occurred in Bethlehem, but the location is debated. The canonical Gospels say it was a stable, while the apocryphal texts say it was a cave. Archaeology confirms the Bethlehem Basilica is built over an authentic cave. The symbolism of the cave is profound. Jesus was born in a cave and buried in a cave, with the earth's womb receiving him and returning him after his resurrection, a strategic theological parallelism. However, Mary's adult life was silenced, as the canonical Gospels ignore her. Her 30 years disappeared, leaving a strategic omission, creating a vacuum. Apocryphal texts suggest hidden powers, unexplained healings, and fulfilled prophecies. But as Mary's sacred feminine powers were persecuted over centuries, she was called a witch and sorceress, labeled a manipulator. Why? Because a woman with such power threatened the patriarchal structures, and patriarchy trembled. The church suppressed the narrative, burned manuscripts, and defined dogmas belatedly. The death of Mary is still the greatest mystery. The Orthodox Church says Dormition, while the Catholics defend Assumption. The Apocrypha suggests a resurrection with conflicting versions. The tomb was opened on the 3rd day, and Mary's body disappeared, leaving only a supernatural fragrance. The apostles were transported by clouds, and Thomas, arriving late, asked to see the tomb, but it was empty. The strategic ambiguity preserved the mystery for centuries. But now documents are resurfacing, and the truth is emerging unfiltered, undomesticated, and uncontrolled. The Roman occupation of Palestine was brutal and systematic. Herod the Great, a paranoid and ruthless tetrarch, governed as a puppet of Rome, willing to eliminate anyone who threatened his political stability. He even killed his own sons, wives, and family members, prioritizing the maintenance of power. Any threat was eliminated. He ordered a census, as detailed in the book of Luke, chapter 2, verse 1, when Augustus Caesar issued a decree that all the world should be registered. This allowed the Romans to strategically control the population, optimize tax collection, and suppress any potential rebellion, tracking movements across the empire. Mary and Joseph traveled to Bethlehem to comply with the census registration required of all descendants of David. Both Mary and Joseph, being of royal blood, combined their lineage in a strategic significance that aligned with the Messiah prophecies. The book of Micah, chapter 5, verses 2, prophesied that the Messiah would come forth from Bethlehem, a small town in Judah, the least of the clans. The prophecy stated, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times." This prophecy was confirmed by the scribes when Herod asked in Matthew 2 verses 5 to 6 where the Messiah would be born. The scribes immediately answered, "Bethlehem." The political implications were evident. The Messiah was coming to restore the kingdom of Israel, and this was a direct threat to Roman rule. Herod feared the potential for political destabilization and religious fanaticism among the zealots, who were already organizing armed resistance against Roman rule. The Magi, or wise men from the east, arrived in Matthew 2 verse 1, following a star seeking the King of the Jews. Their arrival and strategic gathering of intelligence prompted Herod to investigate, and Matthew 2 verse 3 describes how all Jerusalem was troubled by the news of the Messiah's birth. The political ramifications were clear. If the Messiah claimed kingship, it would challenge Roman rule, and this claim could incite rebellion. Herod's response was swift and violent. Matthew 2 verse 16 narrates that Herod, when he saw that he had been deceived by the wise men, was enraged, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under. This genocidal massacre was designed to eliminate the threat and destroy the competition. The political paranoia of Herod mirrored Roman practices for maintaining control through violence, a tactic they employed throughout the empire. In the midst of this, Mary fled to Egypt with Joseph after an angel warned them in a dream, as recorded in Matthew 2 verse 13. "Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." The strategic evacuation took place in the face of political and religious opposition. Egypt was a place of refuge, ironically the place of Israel's former enslavement, now offering protection. The prophecy in Hosea 11:1 was fulfilled, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." After Herod's death, recorded in Matthew 2 verses 19 to 20, the angel appeared again, telling Joseph that it was safe to return to Israel. However, Matthew 2 verse 22 notes that Joseph feared returning to Judea under the rule of Herod's son, Archelaus, a ruler even more brutal than his father. Joseph's strategic caution led to their move to Galilee, settling in Nazareth. As Matthew 2 verse 23 confirms, so was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. The political geography of Galilee was important, as Herod Antipas ruled this region, and it was under a separate jurisdiction, making it less dangerous for the family. The small, obscure village of Nazareth offered strategic anonymity for the child, and Jesus grew there, away from the political spotlight. The silent years of Jesus' life were a strategic period of preparation. Luke 2 verse 52 tells us that Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. During this time, the political implications of being the Messiah remained hidden, as messianic claims were dangerous in such volatile times. The zealots were active, and many false messiahs were executed by the Romans, including Judas the Galilean, Theudas, and Simon Magus. All of these revolts were crushed, and their leaders met death by crucifixion, the Roman method of dealing with insurrectionists and criminals. When Jesus turned 30, he began his public ministry. The timing was strategic, and John the Baptist had been preparing the way, fulfilling the prophecy in Isaiah 43, a voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. Jesus' strategic mission was to transcend the political, religious, and cultural oppression of his time. His death on the cross was not a failure, but the strategic victory of God's plan. As Matthew 28:18 records, after his resurrection, Jesus declared, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." The resurrection of Christ was the strategic victory over death and the establishment of the kingdom of God, one that transcended politics and the corruption of the Roman Empire. The historical record shows the systematic suppression of Mary's narratives. Early church councils made strategic decisions that minimized her role. At the Council of Nicaea in 325 after Christ, under Constantine's presiding leadership, bishops from across the world were assembled to address theological debates, particularly the Arian controversy, which defined Christology. While the primary focus was on defining the nature of Christ, there were also discussions on which books were considered authoritative and which texts would be labeled heretical. This strategic selection of texts was politically motivated and theologically justified. The four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were chosen as canonical, while others, such as the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, and the Gospel of Philip, were rejected. Why this selection? The criteria stated were apostolic authorship, widespread acceptance, and alignment with Orthodox theology. But there was also politics involved. It was about power consolidation, empire building, and defining orthodoxy, while simultaneously eliminating heresy. One of the most strategic decisions of this period was to minimize Mary's role in the narrative. Her references in the Gospels were reduced, and her teachings were suppressed. Why was this strategic? Because Mary represented the feminine divine, spiritual authority, and female leadership, all of which threatened the patriarchal structure that was being established by the imperial church under Constantine. Christianity was being used as a tool for political power, and Mary's influence, especially her Gnostic tendencies, was seen as a challenge to this emerging political alliance. The 4th century saw Jerome translate the Vulgate, the Latin Bible. This version omitted texts, marginalized traditions, and reduced references to Mary. The strategic editing was an act of theological censorship and political compliance. The apocryphal texts were deemed unreliable, historically questionable, and theologically problematic. These texts were conveniently classified as heretical, threatening narratives were suppressed, and teachings deemed subversive were dismissed. Augustine of Hippo, a contemporary of Jerome, developed Mariology, defending her perpetual virginity vigorously. But at the same time, he limited her role. She was to be seen as a passive vessel, an obedient servant, a silent witness. This strategic balance kept veneration without empowerment, respect without authority, and honor without power. The medieval period saw Marian devotion explode in popularity, with cathedrals dedicated to her, prayers multiplying, and apparitions reported. But the Church maintained control through these apparitions, which required approval by bishops, keeping theological boundaries and the power structure intact. During the 12th century, with the Inquisition and the Albigensian Crusade, Cathars, who held Gnostic tendencies and elevated the feminine divine, were targeted. The sacred marriage concepts, including reverence for Mary, were considered heretical, and systematic elimination of these ideas occurred. This was a strategic genocide of ideas, a theological cleansing that aimed to preserve the patriarchal order. The Reformation in the 16th century marked a strategic overcorrection in the Catholic overemphasis on Mary, and Protestants rejected the Mariology excesses. Luther reduced her role, Calvin eliminated it, and Zwingli ignored her completely. Both the Catholic and Protestant extremes missed the balance and lost sight of the truth. This loss was lamentable, as Protestants lost the model of feminine leadership, spiritual authority, and apostolic discipleship that Mary embodied. In response to the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation and the Council of Trent, 1545-1563, reaffirmed the dogmas of Mary's elevated status, but this was done strategically within traditional boundaries that controlled the narrative. The canonical Gospels were exclusively approved, while apocryphal texts were forbidden, and the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, list of forbidden books, was established and enforced for centuries. The Gnostic Gospels and Mary-related traditions were systematically suppressed. The Enlightenment brought rationalism, skepticism, and historical criticism, challenging the biblical scholarship and questioning the authenticity and historicity of the Gospels. Marian narratives were especially vulnerable, with miraculous elements, like the virgin birth, Assumption, and apparitions being questioned by rationalists. However, the archaeological discoveries of the Nag Hammadi texts in 1945 and the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 were revolutionary. These ancient manuscripts confirmed that the texts were authentic and from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, showing Mary's prominent role in early Christianity, especially in the Gnostic Gospels. These teachings recorded her authority, spiritual connection, and wisdom. This strategic suppression has been proven conclusively through modern academic research, but the response from the Church was mixed. While some embraced the evidence, others resisted because it threatened their institutional survival, doctrinal consistency, and political control. The evidence now mounts, showing that the truth about Mary was suppressed for centuries, and the real Mary, powerful, influential, and revolutionary, was hidden. Modern studies on Mary have begun to surface, with feminist theology, liberation theology, and revisionist history exploring the suppressed narratives and hidden traditions. The results have been controversial, with conservative branches of the Church resisting the new interpretations, while progressives have embraced them. Moderates are carefully navigating the delicate balance, but the evidence is mounting, and archaeological discoveries, manuscript translations, and historical analysis are confirming that Mary was significant, powerful, and prominent in early Christianity, holding a leadership role and apostolic authority. The strategic suppression of Mary's narratives has been effective for centuries, but now the truth is emerging. The truth about Mary, her real role as a prophet, teacher, and leader in early Christianity, is finally being rediscovered. The truth prevails, no matter how strategically suppressed it has been. Mary's legacy, her real story, is now emerging from the shadows. The empty tomb is a strategic parallel between Mary and Jesus, with both tombs being found empty on the 3rd day. The bodies of both Jesus and Mary disappeared mysteriously, and both events were surrounded by supernatural explanations. This strategic parallelism has deep theological significance. The early church recognized the pattern between Mary and Jesus, both being resurrected, both glorified, and both assumed into heaven. This concept was developed carefully in strategic theology. In John's Gospel, chapter 20, the empty tomb of Jesus is narrated in detail, and Mary's empty tomb is described in the apocryphal texts, with the pattern repeated across the narratives. This strategic correlation cannot be accidental. It is a deliberate theological construction. The early church sought to establish Mary's status, positioning her closely with Christ, sharing in his destiny and prefiguring salvation. The church fathers, including Ambrose of Milan in the 4th century, wrote extensively on the resurrection of Mary. Augustine of Hippo, a contemporary of Ambrose, agreed substantially with these ideas, while Athanasius of Alexandria, an earlier theologian, pioneered the theology of Mary's Assumption. All of these theologians recognized the strategic importance of the empty tomb of Mary. The strategic problem of explaining Mary's empty tomb was similar to the issue faced by the church regarding Jesus' resurrection. How could it be explained? The disciples were accused of stealing Jesus' body, and the Jews claimed that the resurrection of Jesus was a lie, as stated in Matthew chapter 28, verses 13 to 15. And they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers, telling them, "You are to say, 'His disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble.'" But this strategic lie was ultimately unsuccessful. The empty tomb remained an undeniable, observable fact. Mary's tomb, like Jesus' tomb, was also empty on the 3rd day, as the apocryphal texts claim, though there were no witnesses to the event. In contrast, Jesus' resurrection was witnessed and documented, with 12 appearances listed by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, 5-8, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. In contrast, Mary's Assumption was not witnessed, and no writings document it. The strategic difference in these two events lies in theological implications. Jesus' resurrection was witnessed by many, whereas Mary's Assumption lacked the same documentation. In the canonical Gospels, there is no record of Mary's Assumption, leaving a strategic omission that reflects several key reasons. First, Mary's death was theologically less important than Jesus' death, which accomplished salvation for humanity. Mary's death was not seen as salvific and thus held secondary importance in the theological development of the early church. Secondly, witnesses for Mary's Assumption were fewer, perhaps none at all. In contrast, Jesus' appearances had multiple witnesses, including 500 at once, as stated in 1 Corinthians 15:6. Then he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Third, the church's focus was on Jesus primarily, with Mary considered secondary. Christology took priority over Mariology in the early church, and this theological priority shaped the development of doctrine. Mariology was a later development, emerging over centuries, and strategic focus on Mary was gradual. The Council of Nicaea in 325 after Christ and the subsequent Council of Trent in the 16th century were strategic decisions in preserving unity within the Church and avoiding division. The canonical Gospels were carefully selected and the apocryphal texts were rejected, a strategic decision made to preserve doctrinal unity and avoid political or theological fragmentation. The Church's response to the emerging Gnostic Gospels was to strategically suppress them, as the doctrines they taught threatened the established power structure of the Church. Mary's role, especially her Assumption, was sidelined to maintain a unified narrative and to preserve the power of the patriarchal structures within the Church. However, in modern times, archaeological discoveries such as the Nag Hammadi texts in 1945 and the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 have led to a re-examination of the historical evidence, and new perspectives on Mary's role are emerging. These texts confirm the prominent role of Mary in early Christianity, especially in the Gnostic Gospels, and these findings are challenging the historical record that has been suppressed for centuries. For 2,000 years, the strategic perspective on Mary's story required a deep understanding of God's long game. Immediate results were never the goal. The ultimate transformation and purpose were key. But the Church suppressed Mary's narratives for centuries systematically. However, the truth survived. It was preserved underground, maintained in fragments until the right moment for strategic revelation and divine timing. Manuscripts were discovered in the 20th century, including the Nag Hammadi in 1945 and the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947, confirming what had been suppressed for so long. This strategic timing came at a point in history when the post-war world was questioning authority, seeking authenticity, and dealing with a growing skepticism toward institutional powers. It was the perfect moment for truth to emerge. The Church adapted reluctantly, slowly, and strategically because the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Archaeological discoveries, manuscript translations, and historical analysis all confirmed that Mary was significant, powerful, and prominent in early Christianity. The strategic revelation of Mary's role was controlled with careful navigation over time. The long game has only just begun. The strategic vision that Mary's purpose was not immediate but ultimate, not temporal but eternal, and not institutional but personal, became clear. Mary's role was to facilitate transformation, demonstrate possibility, inspire faith, and model obedience. Her strategic function was and continues to be to facilitate transformation of souls. Over 2,000 years, Mary's relevance has been maintained continuously, despite changing forms. The essence has always been preserved, though it has been adapted to different cultural contexts. Catholic veneration, Protestant rejection, Orthodox honor, and Islamic respect have all been strategic responses to Mary's universal significance. She is a symbol, transcending boundaries, crossing cultures and bridging traditions. Everyone in some way or another relates to her. As a mother archetype, she embodies suffering, hope, and transformation. The strategic positioning of Mary's role allowed for maximum impact across generations and cultures, with diverse interpretations. All these interpretations are valid, whether partial or complete. The truth is multifaceted and reality is complex, with perspective determining understanding. Strategic ambiguity allowed for appropriation and identification of Mary in various ways. The Church learned to control Mary's narrative. Ultimately, it was impossible to control. The truth began to spread organically and naturally. The suppression lasted for centuries, but truth always survives. The strategic lesson of this history is clear. Institutional power is limited, but individual faith is unlimited. Faith is the key. The Spirit moves freely, uncontrollably, transforming continuously and eternally. The modern period has seen an exponential growth in Mary's studies, particularly in feminist theology, liberation theology, and revisionist history. These areas of study have uncovered the suppressed narratives, hidden traditions, and lost teachings. The evidence is undeniable, and scholars from various fields, including archaeology, theology, history, sociology, anthropology, and feminism, have converged to study Mary from all angles. The strategic convergence of multiple disciplines on one subject is allowing for a comprehensive understanding of Mary's role. The feminist recovery of Mary is particularly significant, as it reclaims her power, authority, leadership, and teaching ministry, all of which were suppressed for centuries. This recovery is gradually happening, slowly but strategically. The evidence is undeniable and overwhelming, and the Gnostic Gospels, patristic witnesses, and archaeological findings have confirmed Mary's leadership role as a teacher, disciple, and apostle. While the Church has been resistant, the evidence for Mary's importance is clear, and the institutional inertia that has held back progress is slowly being overcome. Cultural resistance and theological concerns are still factors, But change is coming, inevitably, slowly and steadily. The strategic patience of the Church, which has resisted Mary's full recognition, is slowly giving way to the truth. Over 2,000 years, Mary's story has never truly ended. The foundation has been laid for eternity, and the strategic vision of her role is still unfolding. Mary's relevance continues to grow because she represents universal themes: motherhood, suffering, hope, transformation, loss, grief, victory, and glorification. Everyone experiences these themes in one form or another, and Mary lived through them all, intensely and authentically. Her strategic identification with people is part of her universal appeal. Mary is relevant to Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox, Muslims, Jews, secular people, and the spiritual alike. Everyone finds something relatable in her story, something spiritually meaningful and personally applicable. Her strategic universality has given her global reach and eternal significance. Over 2,000 years, Mary's story has been built with momentum that continues to grow. The truth is spreading, and the suppression is ending. The long game has been won, and the strategic victory has been secured, not in an institutional sense, but through the personal transformation of souls. What if everything believed about Mary was wrong? Fundamentally, completely, and totally wrong. What if the gentle, passive, obedient, silent virgin was actually powerful, prophetic, authoritative, teaching, leading, and threatening to the establishment? That's strategic. Why was she suppressed systematically for centuries? What if Mary, the real historical figure, actually resembled less of the Renaissance paintings and more of the ancient prophets? Less of a passive vessel and more of an active participant? Less of a silent witness and more of a vocal leader? Less of a marginalized woman and more of a central figure in early Christianity? What would that change? Everything, absolutely everything. Theology completely, ecclesiology fundamentally, Mariology obviously, but also anthropology, how we view humanity, soteriology, how we understand salvation, pneumatology, how we experience the Spirit. Everything shifts, perspective changes, understanding deepens, faith matures. When Mary is real, powerful, complex, and threatening, and when she is recognized, acknowledged, and honored appropriately, not domesticated, controlled, or manipulated by the institution, politics, or theology, everything changes. What if, for 2,000 years, half of humanity had been silencing her because they feared the power she represented and the threat she posed? Truth embodied in Mary, demonstrating the possibility of achieving what was available and accessible to women equally as men. The Spirit poured out on all flesh, as prophesied in Joel, chapter 2, verses 28 to 29, and afterward I will pour out my Spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy, your old men will dream dreams, your young men will see visions. This prophecy was fulfilled in Acts chapter 2, verses 17 to 18. The Church chose to suppress the reality, to control the narrative, and to maintain power within a patriarchal structure, institutional authority, and theological orthodoxy. All of this required the diminishment of Mary's role, systematic, intentional, and spanning centuries. The suppression was near complete, but not absolute. Fragments survived underground, preserved until the right moment in divine timing. In the 20th century, manuscripts were discovered and archaeological findings were made. Historical analysis, alongside feminist recovery, converged to reveal the truth about Mary, that she was real, powerful, and central to early Christianity. The strategic vindication came with divine timing and perfect orchestration. What if this had been recognized earlier, centuries ago? What if the reformers had recovered the balance instead of opting for complete rejection? Luther initially respected Mary in his early sermons, giving her considerable honor, but his followers radicalized his position. Iconoclasm followed, images were destroyed, statues broken and devotion eliminated. The reaction was excessive and the loss was lamentable. What if the balance had been maintained appropriately? Mary as the human and divine instrument, powerful, a prophet, a faithful disciple, leading, teaching and modeling discipleship for the entire church, men and women equally honored and appropriately recognized. How different would history and the church have been? Women in ministry, leadership and teaching would have been normal, as expected biblically, following the Mary pattern established by Christ, who validated her role and the Spirit confirmed it. But instead, Mary was suppressed by the church for centuries systematically, impoverishing the kingdom, limiting its effectiveness and hindering the mission. The Spirit grieved, Christ was dishonored, and Scripture was contradicted. All of this was because the church feared the feminine sacred power that Mary embodied and demonstrated. Strategic questions now arise. How would we view women in ministry if Mary's role had been recognized and honored? What if Mary's pattern had been followed? Leadership would have been validated, authority demonstrated, and teaching confirmed. The prophetic gifting would have been evidenced clearly. Discipleship itself would have been viewed as active, not passive. Intelligently submissive yet authoritatively serving, courageously building the kingdom. How would we view suffering? Mary suffered more than most humans ever will, misunderstood, rejected, slandered, and accused. Her son was crucified, and her heart pierced as the prophecy in Luke chapter 2, verses 34 to 35 was fulfilled. Then Simeon blessed them and said to Mary, "This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your own soul too." But Mary's suffering was not meaningless. It was strategic, redemptive, and transformative. Her glorification was promised and guaranteed. Her destiny was revealed, to lead, suffer, and rise again, just as the church must do. The strategic pathway involves building the kingdom, refining the soul, and purifying faith through love and hope. The strategic implications of recognizing Mary's role are immense. The church's theology would be reconstructed, its ecclesiology reformed, its ministry reimagined, and its leadership expanded. Teaching would be empowered, and the prophetic voice would be released. Women would be honored equally, and all would serve together, leading, teaching, and building the kingdom. The church would fulfill its mission by demonstrating love, manifesting grace, and revealing Christ, glorifying the Father. Mary's story shows a strategic revolution that has been overdue for centuries, and it is finally happening. Slowly, gradually, reluctantly, but inevitably, the truth survives always. Mary's real role is being rediscovered, and her strategic victory over suppression is assured. The journey ends, but the truth is just beginning. Mary has been discovered, not merely taught. She was a woman complex, powerful, prophetic, and threatening to the structures of authority, thus silenced for centuries. Her role was controlled institutionally and manipulated theologically. But truth always survives. Fragments remained, traditions resisted, memory persisted underground, hidden until the right time, the strategic moment when divine timing orchestrated it perfectly. And now, here you are. I know the secrets that have been burned, the truths that were hidden, the manuscripts silenced, the mysteries that were locked away, the voices suppressed for so long. The weight of this knowledge is not light, and the responsibility is not small, because knowing the truth demands a response. Ignorance is no longer an excuse. The comfort of illusion has vanished forever. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 12, verses 48 says, "From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded, and from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. You have received much. These revelations are profound, investigations extensive, truths hidden, now exposed. What will you do? Will you guard this as merely information, a historical curiosity, or a theological debate? Or will you allow it to transform your life, redefine your faith, and reorient your journey? Mary lived these mysteries without answers. She waited on promises without deadlines, trusted God without guarantees, endured rejection without defenses, and faced impossibles without retreating. All because she said yes. A teenage girl in Nazareth, frightened but obedient. Her yes had small consequences but eternal impact. Obedience, simple but cosmic. A woman with a common calling yet extraordinary in its fulfillment, and she is not the exception, nor an impossible model. Not an unattainable ideal, unrealistic. She is a mirror reflecting possibilities for us all. If God operated in her, He can operate in you. If God transformed her life, He can transform yours. If God fulfilled promises in her life, He will fulfill His promises to you. Because God does not change, as stated in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 8. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. Jesus Christ, yesterday, today, and forever. His power that operated in Mary is available today, accessible now, and offered freely. The question is not, can God, but will you allow Him? It is not about whether God wants, but whether you accept. It is not about whether God is able, but whether you obey. Mary said yes to the impossible circumstances, improbable consequences, and an uncertain future. She trusted God, knowing that His provision was adequate and His faithfulness guaranteed. And God did not disappoint. He fulfilled magnificently, exceeding abundantly, and glorified eternally. The mysteries of Mary have not been resolved completely, nor fully answered or satisfactorily explained, and this was purposeful, intentional, and pedagogical, because faith does not require absolute certainty, irrefutable evidence, or incontestable proof. Faith requires trust, despite doubts, hope against circumstances, and love overcoming fear. Mary lived that faith, exemplified perfectly and demonstrated completely. She kept things in her heart, demanding not immediate explanations, requiring not complete answers, but needed not total understanding. She trusted the process, awaited God's timing, and rested in His sovereignty. And she was transformed progressively, sanctified continuously, and glorified finally. You are also called to the same path, the same faith, and the same destiny. Not an exemption from mysteries, not protection from doubts, nor absence of difficulties, but the constant presence of God, provision sufficient, grace abundant, and transformation guaranteed. Power not from your own strength, wisdom, or personal capacity, but from absolute dependence on God, trusting completely and surrendering to Christ. This is how Mary lived. This is how you must live. This is how we are all called to exist. So, what now? Where do we go from here? How do we apply all of this? First, recognize that Mary is real, powerful, and complex, not the image of the domesticated, controlled, idealized version. Second, honor her appropriately, biblically, as a disciple, the first witness, and a faithful model to follow. Third, imitate her courageously and radically in life, faith, obedience, and trust, transformation. Fourth, share the truths you have discovered with others, those seekers with sincere hearts and open minds, receptive to Mary's real role. Because knowledge is not merely to accumulate information, but to transform lives, liberate captives, and illuminate the lost. Fifth, pray to Mary as she intercedes in heaven with Christ, with prayers that are powerful and effective. Ask for her intercession and communion with the saints in the church, triumphant and militant, united eternally. Sixth, await the promise of glorification, knowing that your body will be transformed and your life will be eternal in the presence of the divine. Mary was first after Christ, and you are next. This order has been established, and your destiny is guaranteed, with hope firm. If this investigation opened your eyes, hit like now. Write comments with truth if this touched your spirit deeply. Share with those who need to know Mary real, not the domesticated version. Save this video for future study as the revelations are dense and profound. Subscribe and activate notifications as next investigations will shock you even more. God hides not the truth to deceive, but to prepare. He punishes not with mysteries, but transforms through them. He abandons not in darkness, but finds exactly there. Mary lived that truth, and you also can. The mysteries remain, but the presence of God remains too. Doubts arise, but divine faithfulness remains. The journey continues, but the destiny is guaranteed. Mary first, you next. All of us together walking toward glorification, promised transformation, and eternity awaiting. Until the next investigation, remain in faith, grow in love, deepen in hope, and know that God is always faithful.